Hello and welcome to our program, Afrocentricity. I'm the host, Michael Washington. Our program today entitled Reconciliation, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. Before we introduce our guest, let me read a statement from a prominent historian, John Hope Franklin, with regard to the concept of reconciliation. Quote, "Perhaps the very first thing we need to do as a nation and as individual members of society is to confront our past and see it for what it is. If we do that, whites will discover that African Americans possess the same human qualities that other Americans possess, and African Americans will discover that white Americans are capable of the most sublime expressions of human conduct of which all human beings are capable. Then we need to do everything possible to emphasize the positive qualities that all of us have, qualities which we have never utilized to the fullest, but which we must utilize if we are to solve the problem of the color line in the 21st century. Our guest, Mr. Edwin Rigaud. Hi, Ed.
Hi.
Executive Director of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, and who is going to talk a little bit to us today about the concept of reconciliation, its relationship to the Underground Railroad Freedom Center. Just a little bit of background. You're a vice president, Procter & Gamble, on loan for at least 18 more months to keep this project alive. Procter & Gamble, what was your title?
Yes, Dr. Washington, my title, actually, I've had a couple of different titles coming into this position. I was Vice President of Food and Beverage Products at Procter & Gamble, and most recently Vice President of Government Relations, at which point I've come on loan, as you say, for another 18 months. I've already served about a year and 4 months on this project.
And you actually are the person that got this project in its implementation phase. I mean, you've been implementing the ideas of putting together committees and even legislation. I think there's some legislation now that's for the Underground Railroad Museum. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, we, along with Congressman Rob Portman, and Congressman Louis Stokes, both of Ohio, have introduced legislation to affiliate our National Underground Railroad Freedom Center with the National Park Service. And this legislation is really expansive and inclusive because it allows sites all over the country who have a history in the Underground Railroad to also become affiliated with the National Park Service and seek the expert help of the National Park Service as we try to commemorate this very important period in our history.
And it'll be actually law then. What we're talking about is this museum. The sanctioning of it will be part of the legal structure of Ohio in a sense.
Yes, in a large way, this is a national institution that we're attempting to build, and so it has implications not only for our region here in Ohio and Kentucky and Indiana, but also much more broadly around the nation. It represents something that you can consider the hub in the wheel of this whole idea of commemorating the Underground Railroad.
Now, you've put together several committees since the last program. We did a program about a year ago. Today is the 6th month, 9th day, 97, right? June 9th, 1997. About a year ago in June of 96, we did a program with Dan Hurley. We're just kind of getting started here. And I think we were just in the process of getting the implementation phase off the ground. Since that time, a lot has happened in terms of the implementation phase. You got several committees put together, one, the History Committee, which I'm somewhat familiar with, and just a whole lot of things going on. And all of this is related to the concept of reconciliation. This whole ideal of don't want to call it just a museum, but a freedom center, if you will, of reconciliation. Why reconciliation?
Well, we are attempting to borrow on the stories of the Underground Railroad and the principles from those stories, those ideas of leadership and courage, cooperation between the races, the importance of the quest for freedom. All of those were embodied by this Underground Railroad period, which is really a metaphor for us coming together and in the hope of achieving freedom. And we're trying to introduce that notion into contemporary life. So this is going to be an institution that promotes that. And so we've built committees that will help us to identify how we will do this. First, how we will tell this story of the history, and then secondly, how we will get people to start to think about, how do I reapply this and make an attempt to close this gulf between the races, just as there was an attempt made in the 1800s to narrow the gulf between the races and give freedom to everyone.
So it's more than a museum. Even though it will be a museum, it will be more than that, a center, a place of interaction.
That's correct.
Reconciliation. Tell us a little bit about that historically in terms of you have a slide presentation?
Yeah, I'd like to take you through a little bit of the history that we're going to cover, and we're going to do this in very brief shots. We won't be able to cover all of the history. And I'm not a historian, but you are, so wherever you see an opportunity, chime in. But let me show you just a few slides about the Underground Railroad Museum and Freedom Center. This first slide that's shown on the screen is our logo, and it is a candle in the window, which was significant in the history. It was a symbol of a safe house or a safe haven for the runaway or escaping slave. This is going to be a museum of reflection or a museum of conscience, and by that I mean it will touch the heart as well as the mind. We are going to attempt to tell those dramatic stories in a way that people feel them as well as understand them. It's also going to be a distributive museum, and by that I mean it's going to reach out to all of the other sites around the country who are attempting to commemorate this Underground Railroad period. And it will reach out electronically and programmatically to those sites. And our reconciliation programs will be shared with others, just as their programs we hope to share in Cincinnati. It will also be, very importantly, an educational center. We'll teach about the history itself, but we'll also get people to start thinking about how to apply this history. So the center has three purposes, the first of which is commemoration. We're going to commemorate the great heroes of the Underground Railroad, like Harriet Tubman, who's shown here. If you can see her with her passengers, she's carrying a shotgun. Harriet carried that shotgun not just to ward off the slave catchers, but also to keep her passengers in tow.
Yeah, can I make a comment on that?
Yes.
Some people would argue on this one, this is kind of a glorified image of it. It's a really strong artistic expression. But historically, I think that it was a pistol and that the gun was too long, even though that might be controversial. Have you heard anything about that?
The only thing I've read, and I agree that there's different accounts of this, was that she carried both a pistol and a shotgun. But yeah, the pistol was the thing that she brandished the most.
Right, keep you in your place.
Yes. And there's Harriet again, a great hero. And we're going to have great heroes that, who everyone's heard of, like Harriet, but we're also going to have less known people that we're going to identify through research who were great heroes, but they're just not as well known.
That was probably most of the people. I mean, probably we don't know most of them.
That's very correct.
Because they were living lives of reconciliation as a lifestyle, and they weren't concerned about being great spokesmen or anything like this.
That's very true. And of course, this is Frederick Douglass, who was among the most articulate of the escaped slaves, and wrote extensively about his feelings on the condition of slavery. And Sojourner Truth, who was one of the few people fiery enough to talk back to Frederick Douglass, which she did on some occasions. This is William Still from Philadelphia, and his family bought their freedom. He became a minister, and he kept very careful, meticulous notes about the slaves that he helped to escape in what was called the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. And they had an office that they were organized to help slaves to move north onto Canada. And you know, you have to understand that slaves who were escaping to the north after 1850, where there was a Fugitive Slave Act, they were no longer 100% safe in the so-called free states, because the Fugitive Slave Act allowed slave owners to go after their slaves even after they escaped to the north. But William kept very careful notes about hundreds and hundreds of slaves, about where they were from, their names, their family names. And in fact, in one of the interviews he was doing with an escaped slave, he discovered that the person was actually his brother, Peter Still.
Wow.
But his notes are very important to what we're doing, because they will help us, have documented evidence of what was occurring. And this is a man that you know well from who published The Liberator.
William Lloyd Garrison.
William Lloyd Garrison, and he was a very ardent abolitionist.
Did you know also that Garrison believed in women's rights? He's one of the few people at that time that believed in women's rights.
I'd heard that. I don't know much about that part of the story, but that's amazing. And here's Salmon P. Chase, who again is someone you're very familiar with, Dr. Washington. He helped many slaves to fight for their freedom. It was his point of view that if a slave came to Ohio and set foot on free soil, they should be considered free. So he defended them in court, and he was a great defender.
You know, Salmon P. Chase was also the Secretary of the Treasury under Abraham Lincoln.
That's correct.
And would become a Supreme Court justice.
And I think at one time he was even also the governor of Ohio.
Ohio, and a member of the abolitionist organization here.
Oh, yes.
If I'm not mistaken, the president sometime during the 1840s of the Ohio abolitionists.
Oh, okay, yeah. These are two important people, Levi and Catherine Coffin. They were Quakers, and again in the 1800s, spent much of their lives helping escaping slaves. First in Fountain City, Indiana, which at the time was known as Newport, and then later in Cincinnati, where Levi Coffin spent his last 30 years here in the Cincinnati area. He lived in 5 different places in downtown Cincinnati. He had shops, and in total helped to escape about 3,000 slaves. And he is sometimes referred to as the president of the Underground Railroad. Actually, there was no real president, but that's a title that was sometimes used for him.
I think John Rankin up there down there in
Ripley, Ohio.
Ripley, Ohio also had that title. So
Yes.
I guess it depended upon where you lived. Who could be the president.
This is Levi Coffin's house in Indiana. This is not too clear a picture, but it's a drawing of Levi Coffin's house on 6th and Elm in downtown Cincinnati. And here's the Allen Temple AME Church, which was also very, very involved in the escape of slaves, and as you say, in reconciliation. So commemoration is the first part. The next purpose of the center is education. And we're going to attempt to tell the true stories of the Underground Railroad. As you know, as a member of our history committee, we will attempt to be very accurate in the telling of these stories. This is a painting that hangs in the Cincinnati Art Museum.
Charles Weber's painting?
That's correct, called the Underground Railroad. And it depicts one aspect of the Underground Railroad. This is after the slaves had crossed into the north, here on the outskirts of Cincinnati in this case. And in the picture, you might be able to detect Levi and Catherine Coffin in the center, and another Quaker woman by the name of Hannah Haydock on the left. This is one version and the typical image that people have of the Underground Railroad, but it's really not the only story.
Now, what version, how would you explain that version? Would that be just whites rescuing helpless blacks, and blacks are the victims of this escape, and whites are the ones who are the rescuers? Or
that's correct, and that really did not happen until the slave was already in free territory. It was very unusual that they would get help like this before they actually escaped. So here's another aspect to the story that's not often told, where it was a self-determination of the slaves that led them to make the escape. They're the ones who said, I want freedom, and I want it so badly I'll risk my life to do it, or I'll separate from my family in order to do it. And they were under all kinds of very difficult circumstances, including dogs chasing them, or bad weather conditions, or no food and improper clothing. So it was a very courageous act on the part of slaves, and this is a very important point that I think all African Americans particularly need to understand, that there was self-determination here, not just someone holding their hand. This is a map showing some of the major routes of the Underground Railroad, and you can see they travel mostly north into the Free States and into Canada, because Canada was ultimately the place that you could get to if you were escaping that would be free. But it also shows lines going into Mexico, where slaves escaped, into the center of Florida, where they hid among Seminole Indians, and into the Caribbean and Cuba, where many, many slaves escaped.
It's quite extensive. It's an international concept just by itself, isn't it?
That's correct. It crosses borders, international borders. Now, this one is a little difficult to see, but the point I want to make here is that even though there was a smooth line going through Ohio, if you blow that up to see what the escape routes really looked like, it was much more like a spider web. So there were many, many areas that were areas of escape. The same can be shown in Kentucky and in Indiana. So lots of small towns, rural areas have historic sites that they value and treasure.
An effective network, in other words. If you blow that up, you would see a spider web, and that spider web indicates an effective network, a net that's working.
That's
for the reconciliation of humanity, if you will.
That's very beautifully put, and I think that is something that we should have as a vision for how reconciliation could be done today. Mm-hmm. That's very well said. Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is her house her father's house on Gilbert Avenue. It's called the Harriet Beecher Stowe home. And here, Uncle Tom's Cabin. On the right is one of the characters, Eliza Harris, crossing on the Ohio River on ice, in fact, in Ripley, Ohio. She fell in about 3 times, carrying her baby, And when she got to the other side, a slave catcher was there and said since she had been so brave and made this escape, he was going to let her go. And she went on up to John Rankin's house there in Ripley.
Mm-hmm. Incidentally, the one guy, that was Josiah Henson, that was the Uncle Tom, wasn't it?
That's right.
That was the image that individual that Harriet Beecher Stowe used to write her novel, or Josiah Henson. And he's known, people don't recognize this, but he became internationally known.
That's right.
I think he was probably close to 50 or so by the time he became free. And from that age, he became literate. He wrote a book. He traveled around the world, England, and he became very, very well known and ended up settling up there in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yes. On the left here is Lyman Beecher, who is Harriet Beecher Stowe's father, and he ran what was called the Lane Seminary. And at the Lane Seminary, there were many debates about slavery. This is one of the men who took part in that debate, James Bradley. He was the only African-American student at the seminary and may have been one of the first African-American students at an institution of higher learning in this country.
Now that particular statue of him is right over there in Covington,
Covington, on the Riverwalk, that's correct. And he argued in the debates that lasted 9 evenings about abolition versus colonization, which meant sending the slaves back to Africa. And he argued on the side of immediate abolition, and that won the day. And about 39 students bolted from Lane Seminary at that point and went up to Oberlin College.
It was Theodore Weil was teaching at the Lane Seminary at that time. I think he was the guy that kind of organized that and took them up to Oberlin where they could actually engage in that kind of dialogue.
That's correct. This is Margaret Garner and her 4 children. Margaret escaped from Kentucky and was hiding out in the home of a free black man in Cincinnati, in an area which was referred to as Bucktown. And as the owner was away trying to get help from Levi Coffin, the slave catchers and marshals broke into the house. And Margaret had a butcher knife. She slit her daughter's throat, killed her, and exclaimed she was going to kill all of her children rather than return to slavery, and herself rather than have the family return to slavery. And this really tells you how strong the emotion was and how strong the passion was. You know, even though some slaves may have had decent living conditions, they didn't have freedom, and many of them had terrible living conditions. So there was a lot of passion and desire to want to escape. And this is a classic story of that. It's not the only story of people killing their children to avoid slavery.
The book Beloved is made on that.
That's correct.
And there's a movie.
Right, and Oprah Winfrey owns the rights, and she's actually going to star as Margaret Garner in that picture, and Walt Disney's going to do the production. This is Ripley, which you mentioned earlier, Ripley, Ohio, which is indeed a tremendous historic place, and across the water in Maysville, Kentucky. Both tremendous places. This is Ripley today. This is John Rankin, and he was a Presbyterian minister who helped many, many slaves, and it's well documented.
Now, some people don't know that that Rankin house is there, but down the street from there is a cemetery, and his bust is on his gravestone there in
right.
green. It's green.
Yes.
It's the only green one there.
Beautiful place to visit. If you go up the hill and see the Rankin home, it's got an expansive view of the river.
Wow.
And just a wonderful spiritual place almost. Also in Maysville, very spiritual. And here is another house that sits down from the John Rankin house right on the river. And this is John Parker home. Charlie Knuckles is standing in front of here. He's leading a group to restore this home. This home and a foundry which was built next door to it was owned by John Parker, an escaped slave who helped save over 900 slaves. Great story also.
John Parker also was in the book for inventions. He was also an inventor.
He had 3 patents. So commemoration, education, and inspiration. And lastly, this inspiration here is a story, Henry Box Brown, who had himself crated up, shipped from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia. And when he came out of the box at the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee office with William Still standing in the background, he sang a hymn, "I prayed to the Lord, and the Lord heard my prayer." He had made his escape, and this is a wonderful, inspirational story. And of course, the river was inspirational. The slaves talked about it as the River Jordan. They sang about it, and this is why we want to build our center on the Ohio River. So many escapes were made at that point. And this is a house in Kentucky, Millersburg, Kentucky. It's the Batterton House. It was a haven for a safe haven for slaves. Here's the area where they escaped. And it was very, very brave for, here's a slave cabin right near that Batterton House. Very brave for people in Kentucky to help slaves. So commemoration, education, and inspiration, all leading up ultimately to reconciliation. That is what we're trying to do. We think if people learn this history, Dr. Washington, that they will be so inspired to come together. We want this to be an inclusive place. And so far we're well on the way to making it a reality.
Was there a last shot with the hope in the window there?
There is. It's a few slides down, but we think that the purpose here will be to get everyone to put a candle in their own window.
And the purpose of the museum, or the center, is to provide the ongoing stimulation to reconcile, if you will, making it part of the culture of not just the region, the state, but the nation and the world, perhaps even the world.
That's right. We're going to have a place where people can come internationally and talk about subjects of freedom, and they will be inspired by the museum and the great heroics that occurred during this period.
That's wonderful. I had communication from some people in Japan who have the Liberty Osaka Museum, the only human rights museum in the world, and they're interested in getting information about this museum and having some collaboration, perhaps.
Well, Bishop Desmond Tutu just joined our national board.
Absolutely, excellent. Absolutely, absolutely. You have a monumental task. I mean, it's one thing to build an institution. It's another thing to have the kind of use that space in a way that inspires. We know we can educate. We can commemorate, but the concept of inspiration. That's almost spiritual.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. But I think we can do it. I mean, the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. has demonstrated
is a model.
Absolutely a way to do that and have people leave this place changed for the better.
Well, you certainly have me on your side.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, folks. This has been an absolutely wonderful program. And stay tuned for the next one. Have a good evening.